On the 10th of January, 1475, 20,000 freezing Moldavian soldiers stood in a fog-shrouded valley, waiting to face 120,000 Ottoman warriors. By sunset, 45,000 Ottoman corpses would litter the frozen earth, while the defenders lost just 4,500 men. This is the story of history's most devastating tactical ambush. The survival of the last Christian buffer state between Islam and Europe hung in the balance. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a tiny nation's prince engineered one of military history's most brilliant defensive victories. You'll discover how frozen rivers became death traps for thousands, why fog proved more deadly than arrows, and the three-word message that changed European history forever. How did Stephen know exactly when and where the massive Ottoman army would attack? What medieval technology allowed 20,000 men to defeat 45,000 in a single day? Why did the Ottoman survivors flee in terror from an enemy they still outnumbered? Think about this. How could the greatest military empire on earth fall into such a perfect trap? How did a prince of a tiny nation outsmart the conqueror of Constantinople himself? Stephen the Great had already survived 36 battles, but this time he faced the fury of Mehmed the Conqueror himself. The man who had taken Constantinople, ended the Byzantine Empire, and struck fear into every European court had set his sights on Moldova. Personal vendetta fueled imperial ambition. Stephen had refused to pay tribute, had raided Ottoman territories, and worst of all, had defeated Ottoman armies before. But here's what the Ottoman scouts missed. Stephen had been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years. Every frozen stream, every fog-prone valley, every narrow pass had been studied, mapped, and transformed into a potential killing field. The Ottomans thought they were hunting a mouse. They were about to discover they'd walked into the den of a wolf. To understand how this miracle happened, we need to go back 3 years. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell because next week we're revealing another impossible victory that shaped our world. Now, let me transport you back to medieval Moldavia. The year 1453 had changed everything. Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom for over 1,000 years, had fallen to Ottoman cannons. Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, had achieved what countless Muslim rulers had failed to do. Now he was no longer just a sultan, he was the conqueror, and his appetite for expansion seemed limitless. By 1474, Ottoman armies had swallowed the Balkans, reduced Hungary to a nervous wreck, and turned the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake. Venice trembled. Poland prayed. The Pope called for crusades that never materialized. Christianity itself seemed to be retreating before the Islamic tide. But in the small principality of Moldavia, wedged between Poland, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, ruled a different kind of prince. Stephen III had inherited his throne at just 23, fighting his own uncle for the crown. In the 17 years since, he'd fought 36 battles and won them all. His people called him Stefan Selmer, Stephen the Great. Foreign ambassadors described him differently, short in stature, but a giant indeed. Moldavia was the gateway to Europe. Control it, and Ottoman armies could pour into Poland and Hungary simultaneously. Lose it, and Christian Europe kept its critical buffer. The principality stretched from the Carpathian Mountains to the Black Sea, a land of deep forests, winding rivers, and fog-prone valleys, terrain that could become an ally to those who knew its secrets. The tribute system had worked for decades. Christian vassals paid gold to the Sultan. The Sultan left them semi-autonomous. It was extortion, but it brought peace. Stephen had paid at first 40,000 gold florins annually, enough to bankrupt most kingdoms. But then something changed. Stephen stopped paying. Worse, he started raiding Ottoman territories, freeing Christian slaves, burning Turkish settlements. Mehmed the Conqueror took notice. This was the man who'd conquered Constantinople, annexed Anatolia, and made emperors kneel. His military machine was the most advanced on earth. Elite Janissary infantry, Sipahi cavalry, massive bombardments, and most terrifyingly, seemingly limitless manpower. When Mehmed decided to destroy a nation, that nation ceased to exist. Stephen knew the storm was coming. But rather than flee or submit, he did something extraordinary. He prepared. For 3 years, every village trained with weapons. Every valley was mapped for ambush potential. Every river crossing was studied for defensive possibilities. Gunpowder was stockpiled, imported from Poland, despite the massive cost. Stephen even sent spies into Ottoman territory, learning their march routes, their supply systems, their commanders' personalities. The warrior monk prince, for Stephen heard mass twice daily even on campaign, understood something Mem's generals didn't. Numbers didn't matter if you couldn't use them. The Ottomans depended on crushing enemies in wide-open battles with sheer force. But what happened when there wasn't an open field? What if the enemy refused to fight where Ottoman strengths mattered? By the winter of 1474, Mehmed had gathered 120,000 troops under Suleiman Pasha Hadambal. About 40,000 were elite soldiers, backed by eager Wallachian vassals trying to prove themselves. Stephen, meanwhile, could scrape together maybe 20,000, peasant levies, boyar horsemen, a handful of Polish mercenaries, and his personal guard. 6-1. David versus Goliath, except this David had spent 3 years turning his homeland into a weapon. Stephen held an advantage the Ottomans didn't expect, home ground designed to kill. When the Ottoman army entered Moldavia that December, it looked unstoppable. At its core marched 12,000 janissaries, child-taken, lifelong soldiers who had never lost a major fight. They were the best infantry on earth, famous for holding formation even under rainstorms of arrows. Behind them came 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, men raised in a warrior tradition stretching from Baghdad to Belgrade. Each one kept his own gear and chased glory and plunder. Behind the cavalry trudged 60,000 Azib irregulars, volunteers hoping for riches and salvation in holy war. Their supply train stretched for miles with cannons, powder, food, and camp followers. Leading all of this was Suleiman Hadambal, a veteran of 20 campaigns. European writers said he was as proud as Lucifer and twice as clever. He had crushed Serbs, scattered Hungarians, and burned his way through Bulgaria. Moldavia, he believed, would be another notch on the empire's belt. Then Stephen did something no defender had ever dared. He ordered every village within 50 miles of the Ottoman advance to burn their crops, poison their wells, and vanish into the woods. Ottoman scouts found only abandoned homes and scorched land. No food, no shelter, nothing to help an army lost in the brutal January cold. Compared to this massive force, Stephen's army looked tiny. Only about 6,000 trained troops formed his corps, his guard and the boyar's private forces. 10,000 peasants answered his call, armed with whatever they could grab. Axes, hunting bows, flails. 1,000 Polish mercenaries, paid with money Stephen didn't really have, brought professional cavalry. Another 3,000 frontier fighters, men raised on constant raiding, rounded out his ranks. But the Ottomans had already made their first fatal mistake. They assumed Stephen would defend his capital at Suceava or stand and fight in the open, where their numbers could wash over him. What they didn't know was that every Moldavian fighter knew the land like their own skin, and Stephen had prepared one specific valley with deadly precision. Vaslui Valley stretched 8 miles north to south, tightening at 3 natural choke points carved by ancient rivers. In summer, it was grazing land. In winter, it trapped fog. Cold air sank, moisture from the streams rose, and a heavy mist hung almost constantly. Stephen's engineers had turned this landscape into a nightmare. They rerouted streams to form shallow marshes that froze just enough to hold a man, but not a horse. They dug ditches and hid them under snow. They built secret artillery nests at both ends of the valley. Stephen's intelligence network now paid off. Moldavian merchants inside Ottoman camps sent word of troop movements. Christian slaves in the supply train slipped out news of the army's route. Most importantly, Stephen learned the Ottoman force was unraveling. After 3 weeks of marching through frozen emptiness, the irregulars were disheartened. Even the janissaries grumbled about winter fighting. The Sipahi fretted over their horses, already weakened by lack of fodder. As January began, Stephen sowed carefully crafted lies. Deserters reached the Ottomans claiming the Moldavian army was falling apart, that Stephen was fleeing north, that panic had set in. Suleiman, determined to end the campaign before winter got worse, pushed his troops into forced marches toward Stephen's supposed retreat. Then the psychological warfare deepened. Ottoman sentries heard eerie sounds at night, war horns echoing across empty hills, footsteps that faded into silence. Patrols vanished, later found frozen in the woods. Fear crept into the ranks. These Moldavians fought like devils and moved like ghosts. Still, what could 20,000 men really do against 120,000? Here's where everything snaps. What happened next ignored every rule of warfare. Stephen wasn't running. He was steering the Ottomans straight into the trap he'd built for them. The frozen rivers, the narrowing valley, the timing of the morning fog. Every piece was sliding into place. And on January 10th, under a strangely heavy dawn mist, 120,000 Ottomans marched straight toward death. That morning looked almost unreal. Fog poured through the Vaslui valley like it had a mind of its own, thick enough that men could barely see 20 meters ahead. Soldiers shuffled forward, following only the shape in front of them. Sound was muted, distance warped, and the land around them felt otherworldly. Veteran fighters muttered about omens. This didn't feel like weather, it felt like witchcraft. The Ottoman line stretched 5 miles long, a massive serpent squeezing into an ever-tightening valley. Suleiman Hadambal rode with the front 30,000, 5,000 of them janissaries. Behind came the main body, then the long supply train, then the rear guard. It was a formation that had worked for decades. But that was on open ground. This valley was anything but. Stephen watched from the heights, completely hidden by the fog. His army sat in 3 prepared layers. Up front, 3,000 light cavalry and mounted archers waited to hit the vanguard. Higher up the slopes, 8,000 infantry with bows and early firearms lined the narrowing section where the valley pinched to 200 meters. And at the far end, Stephen's reserves and heavy cavalry blocked any escape. 8 cannons, bought at a brutal price, sat camouflaged and ready. Now it gets wild. The same fog choking the Ottomans gave Stephen total control. His fighters knew every bend and stream. They could move blind. The invaders couldn't. The first strike came at 10 a.m. Moldavian horsemen burst from the fog, fired a volley of arrows, and slipped away. Janissaries closed ranks and advanced, straight into emptiness. The riders had vanished. Arrows suddenly came from the left, then the right, then behind. Ottoman discipline kicked in. Suleiman sent 2,000 Sipahi cavalry forward to crush the harassers. The Moldavians pulled back, always just visible enough to lure the chase deeper into the valley. Then the fog swallowed everyone. A moment later, the screams began. The Sipahi galloped onto what looked like solid ice, until it cracked. Horses plunged into freezing mud and water. Moldavian archers, standing safely on firm ground, picked off the trapped cavalry one by one. Armored men and heavy mounts couldn't free themselves. In 20 minutes, 2,000 elite Sipahi simply disappeared from the war. But the main Ottoman column kept pushing forward, clueless about the slaughter ahead. The valley narrowed. The mist thickened. Then Stephen unleashed his war horns, dozens of them, blaring from every direction. And here's the genius. Stephen had tested the valley's acoustics for months. The sound bounced off the hills in ways that made it feel like an enormous invisible army was closing in. Panic spread through the irregulars. Where were the attackers? How many were there? Why couldn't anyone see a thing? Suleiman tried to hold his army together, but directing 120,000 men through a fog-choked bottleneck was hopeless. Units lost contact. The formation collapsed in on itself. Men tripped over each other in the chaos. Ottoman strengths, discipline, coordination, combined arms, vanished in the mist. Then the hidden traps claimed their first victims. Infantry stumbled into buried ditches, deep enough to cause injuries, shallow enough to be invisible under snow. The men behind shoved forward blindly, driving more into the pits. No one could warn anyone. The fog smothered every shout. Stephen's artillery fired next. The cannons weren't meant to wipe out troops. Medieval guns couldn't. They were meant to terrify. Each blast echoed through the valley until it sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. In the fog, no one could tell where the shots came from. Ottoman soldiers couldn't see the cannon flashes, couldn't locate the guns, couldn't fire back. All they could do was stand there as each unseen blast shook their nerves. Then the Moldavian infantry went to work. These weren't glory-chasing knights. They were farmers and woodsmen fighting for their homes. They knew defeat meant their families enslaved and their churches burned. They attacked with cold precision from the fog. Arrow volleys cut through the mist in perfect rhythm. Early handguns, slow, loud, and terrifying, added bursts of smoke and shock. After each volley, the shooters disappeared, shifted positions, and struck again from somewhere else. Ottoman officers barked orders. Form square, hold position, face outward. But how do you form a square when you can't see your own men? How do you brace for an enemy who appears from nowhere and vanishes? The Janissaries stayed disciplined, but the regular troops began to crack. And the fog hid another Moldavian trick. Stephen's men had scattered oil-soaked straw in key spots. Now they set it ablaze. Fires flared inside the mist. Not enough to burn men, but enough to mix smoke with the fog and create a choking wall. At that moment, Ottoman formations completely collapsed. What had been a mighty army turned into a trapped mob. And they didn't know the worst part. Stephen had funneled the entire force into a narrowing slaughterhouse. Behind them, Moldavian troops sealed the entrance. Ahead, Stephen's best fighters blocked the valley's dead end. On both sides, arrows waited. At noon, Stephen spoke 3 words that changed history. Spring the trap. A storm of arrows erupted from the hidden ridges like the wrath of heaven. 10,000 Moldavian bowmen, lined in 3 ranks along both valley walls, fired volley after volley. The fog concealed them so completely that the Ottomans saw only waves of arrows suddenly materializing, darkening the mist before tearing into flesh. Janissary discipline meant nothing when the enemy was invisible. Sipahi armor meant nothing when arrows rained from above. The irregulars, packed shoulder to shoulder, became a roaring mass of pain and panic. Stephen's officers gave a simple command: fire and move. The archers shot 3 volleys, then slipped back to new positions 50 meters away. Any Ottomans who rushed toward the original firing lines found only empty ground, right before new volleys cut them down from fresh angles. This wasn't battle. It was controlled extermination. Then the cannons spoke again, 8 guns firing in sequence from the valley's end. The blasts boomed through the confined space, bouncing off the hills so wildly that no one could tell where the guns actually were. Stephen's gunners had pre-sighted every shot during months of planning. They couldn't miss. The valley floor was packed with bodies. Each cannon blast carved bloody trenches through the Ottoman column. But the true damage wasn't physical, it was psychological. Many irregulars had never faced artillery. To them, the invisible thunder tearing men apart felt supernatural, like the mountains themselves had turned against them. Then, something no one expected happened. The Janissaries, the empire's finest, launched a counterattack. These were the men who took Constantinople. Retreat wasn't in their vocabulary. Even in the chaos, they formed defensive squares, spears pointing in all directions. Their officers, wearing ornate helmets, shouted over the panic. "We are the Sultan's chosen. We do not break." And that was the moment the empire learned fear. From 3 sides at once, Moldavian heavy cavalry burst out of the fog. Stephen's armored boyars, his own household guard, and Polish mercenaries hungry for honor. They slammed into the Ottoman flanks like steel hammers shattering glass. 2,000 boyar horsemen smashed straight into the Ottoman left. These Moldavian riders came from families who'd fought steppe raiders for generations. They grew up in the saddle, trained for this kind of charge their whole lives, and knew every inch of the valley. They had practiced this exact maneuver again and again. When armored cavalry slammed into panicked infantry, the result was pure devastation. Ottoman troops, already rattled by unseen arrows and cannon blasts, couldn't form any real defense. The boyars tore through them like a scythe through wheat. On the right flank, 1,000 Polish mercenary lancers, veterans who'd fought everywhere from Prussia to the Black Sea, hit the column where it bottlenecked. Their lances shattered on impact, but the Poles drew swords and axes without breaking stride. The fog that crippled Ottoman coordination barely touched them. They simply rode forward and cut down anything in their way. But the masterstroke came from the valley's mouth. Stephen led his own 3,000 household troops in a direct assault on the Ottoman vanguard. These were his finest men, elite armor, powerful war horses, drilled for this terrain. They crashed into the Ottomans just as the army tried shifting from marching column to battle formation, the worst possible moment. Ottoman doctrine depended on space, time, and careful organization. Stephen denied them all three. The entire formation disintegrated in the fog like a house of cards in a hurricane. Units couldn't find each other, much less support one another. The valley floor, already churned to mud by 100,000 feet, turned into a slaughter pit. Men slipped and fell, then were trampled by their own comrades. Horses screamed and thrashed. The narrow valley, meant to shield the Ottoman flanks, had become a cage. In just an hour, 15,000 Ottomans were dead. But the math of death was only beginning to reveal its worst side. The killing field lived up to its name. Bodies piled up at the choke points, forming grotesque human dams. Soldiers trying to escape climbed over their own dead, adding to the heap. Wounded men, crushed under armored corpses, screamed for help. Blood mixed with mud until the valley floor turned into a red, sucking mire that slowed everyone to a crawl. At the center, the Janissaries made their last stand, an epic moment inside the larger tragedy. 5,000 of the Empire's finest locked into a defensive square, spears outward, keeping discipline even as the world collapsed around them. Their commander, Mehmed Aga, battle-tested in 30 campaigns, knew they were finished but refused to yield. "We die standing," he told them. "Let these dogs remember Ottoman courage." Stephen admired courage, but war allowed no mercy. He ordered all guns to focus on the Janissary square. Cannonballs tore gaps through the ranks. When openings appeared, Moldavian arrows filled them. Still, they held. Their square shrank, 5,000, then 3, then 1. Janissaries threw themselves onto Moldavian lances to create paths for their brothers. Officers kept fighting despite lethal wounds. But bravery couldn't overcome Stephen's calculated, grinding trap. Then came a sound that froze every heart, ice cracking like thunder. The frozen river at the valley's end, weakened by Stephen's engineers and now carrying the weight of thousands of fleeing Ottomans, began to break. What followed shattered every rule of medieval warfare. The Rakova River, usually just a quiet stream, had been dammed upstream by Stephen's men. That morning, the dams were released. Water flowed beneath the ice, thinning it from below. The surface looked solid, strong enough for a man or even a single horse. But thousands of panicked soldiers? Impossible. Cracks spidered across the frozen sheet as irregulars fled the massacre. Then whole sections gave way. Armored men carrying weapons and often loot dropped into water just above freezing. Many died from shock the instant they hit the current. Others tried to swim, but their armor dragged them down. The strengthened current sucked men beneath the ice, trapping them under a translucent ceiling. Soldiers could be seen clawing upward, eyes wide with terror, until the cold claimed them. Here's where Stephen's brilliance reached its peak. He had calculated everything. The timing of the dam release, the thickness of the ice, even the load that would cause failure. Ottoman soldiers faced an impossible choice. Stand and die under Moldavian arrows, or flee across ice that might swallow them. Thousands chose the ice. Thousands died. The river turned into a watery graveyard. Bodies piled against the remaining sheets of ice, forming temporary dams. Water built up behind them, then burst forward, sweeping more corpses downstream. Moldavian archers along the riverbank didn't hesitate. Men struggling in the water were easy targets. Those who somehow reached the far shore, frozen, exhausted, half drowning, found more Moldavians waiting. This wasn't battle anymore. It was math and death working hand in hand. And somehow it got worse. A few Ottoman groups, Mostly Sipahi cavalry who had dodged the early ambush, tried to ford the river farther upstream. Stephen had predicted that too. Moldavian horsemen shadowed them from the opposite bank, turning every crossing attempt into suicide with steady arrow fire. Any who actually made it across arrived soaked, shaken, and completely alone, only to face fresh Moldavian reserves. These weren't fights. They were executions. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman army no longer existed as a single force. What began as 120,000 men had broken into scattered clusters of terrified survivors looking for any way out. The fog, which had briefly thinned at noon, returned thicker than ever. Soldiers wandered blindly, stumbling into Moldavian patrols, frozen marshes, even their own panicked comrades. A few janissary groups tried to keep formation, islands of discipline in a sea of chaos. But Stephen's trap still had one final door to close. The valley entrance, the path the Ottomans had marched through that morning, was now blocked by 5,000 untouched Moldavian reserves. These men had waited all day, hearing the distant screams and cannon fire. Their nerves had sharpened into steel. Now they faced the exhausted, wounded Ottomans trying desperately to flee. What followed wasn't a clash, it was slaughter. The broken Ottoman masses smashed into Moldavian ranks like waves hitting cliffs. And then came the moment that decided everything. Suleiman Hadambal, the proud commander who had once terrified Europe, tried to rally a final breakout. He gathered maybe 3,000 survivors, janissaries, loyal Sipahi, and his personal guard. They pulled themselves together the best they could and drove straight at the Moldavian line. Stephen rode out to meet them himself. The two forces collided with a crash chroniclers swore echoed through the valley. For a breathless moment, Ottoman discipline and desperation pushed the Moldavians back. A gap opened, hope flickered. Then Stephen unleashed his reserves on both flanks. The already broken formation shattered like glass. Suleiman Hadambal fell beneath a storm of lances. With his death, the last organized Ottoman resistance died with him. And then 45,000 men paid the price for underestimating a cornered wolf. When the sun finally broke through the fog around 3 p.m., it revealed a nightmare landscape. The Vaslui Valley, pristine and white that morning, had become a vast grave. Bodies covered the ground so completely that the earth was invisible beneath them. The narrow passes were clogged with corpses stacked 10 deep. Blood mixed with mud into a red swamp that would poison the soil for years. Counting began at sunset. Even hardened Moldavian veterans cried at what they found. 45,000 Ottoman dead. A number too large to even grasp. It was more than twice the size of Stephen's entire army. Janissaries lay in towering piles where they made their final stands. Sipahi cavalry and their horses formed grotesque barricades at the riverbanks. Irregulars littered the valley, slain by arrows, crushed in the panic, or frozen in the river. Between 8 and 12,000 had drowned under the ice alone. When spring thaw came, bodies floated downstream for months. Entire Ottoman units had vanished from existence. The Sultan's third Janissary order, once 1,000 strong, left only 17 men alive. A cavalry regiment that helped conquer Belgrade returned home with just 40 survivors out of 2,000. Some irregular units had no survivors at all. Against that horror, Moldavian losses looked unreal, only 4,500 dead and wounded. Preparation, terrain mastery, and perfectly timed ambushes had created one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Stephen destroyed 3/4 of Mem's invading force while losing less than 1/4 of his own. And here's the detail that reshaped everything. Stephen's restraint afterward mattered as much as the victory itself. His boyars begged him to chase the broken Ottoman remnants into their own territory. The empire's European army was broken, and the road to the Danube lay wide open. But Stephen refused to chase the retreating Ottomans. "We are defenders, not conquerors," he told his war council. "Let the world remember this. Moldavia destroys invaders, but threatens no neighbor who respects our borders." That restraint was a stroke of brilliance. By holding back, Stephen avoided the kind of overreach that had doomed so many victors before him. More importantly, he sent a message to Europe: Moldavia fought to survive, not to expand. That clarity would matter once the Ottomans inevitably returned. But the fog still hid one last secret. Among the dead, Moldavians found documents revealing the true scale of Mehmed's plan. This hadn't been a simple punishment raid. It was phase one of a sweeping conquest, the takeover of Moldavia, followed by invasions of Poland and Hungary. The maps showed future Ottoman fortresses built on Moldavian soil. Lists named European nobles slated to be replaced by Ottoman governors. Europe hadn't been saved from a raid. It had been saved from a blueprint for complete domination. Survivor accounts only deepened the shock. Ottoman soldiers who escaped spoke of Moldavian demons, who rose from fog and vanished like ghosts, of rivers that devoured whole battalions, of Christian sorcery turning the land itself against Islam. Many never served again, broken by the memory of that valley. The psychological victory was even greater than the physical one. Ottoman invincibility died in Moldavia that day. Stephen sent a simple 3-word message to every European court. We have won. No boasting. No details. Just 3 words that told Christendom the impossible had happened. David had crushed Goliath. Couriers carried the message to Rome in 6 weeks. Pope Sixtus IV reportedly dropped to his knees in gratitude when he heard it. Across Europe, reactions swung from disbelief to celebration. Venice declared 3 days of festivities. Poland rang church bells from Krakow to Gdansk. Even France's Louis XI, normally indifferent to foreign affairs, sent congratulations. The name Stephen of Moldavia spread across Europe as a rallying cry. If 20,000 Moldavians could obliterate a force 6 times their size, maybe Christendom wasn't doomed after all. Then came the Pope's official response, far beyond anything expected. Sixtus IV granted Stephen the title Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ, an honor reserved only for the greatest defenders of the faith. Papal bulls urged all Christian rulers to support Moldavia. Indulgences were offered to anyone aiding Stephen's cause. For a brief moment, quarreling Christian powers united in admiration of the Moldavian prince. And Stephen showed exactly why he deserved that title. As night fell on January 10th, he walked among the dead, Christian and Muslim alike. Witnesses saw him weeping, praying for every soul. He ordered Ottoman bodies treated with dignity and buried properly, despite the overwhelming task. When questioned about showing mercy to fallen enemies, he simply said, "They came as conquerors but died as men. God alone judges souls." The immediate aftermath reshaped the Balkans. Ottoman expansion into Europe stalled completely. Tribute demands stopped. Raids ended. For the first time in decades, Ottoman troops pulled back from Christian borders. The empire that had seemed unstoppable now knew it could bleed, could fear, could fail. European rulers who once considered surrender began preparing to resist. The survivors' descriptions still haunt historians. The valley had turned into something beyond medieval brutality. Mud soaked red, walls of corpses blocking streams, and an eerie silence after the fighting, broken only by wind and circling ravens. Some called it divine judgment. Others saw ruthless military genius. But Stephen understood the truth. This was only the opening act. Mehmed would return, and with vengeance. Yet the long echo of Vaslui shaped Europe for years. Ottoman expansion into Central Europe paused for 3 crucial seasons, buying Poland time to fortify, Hungary time to rebuild its armies, and the Holy Roman Empire time to prepare for the wars that lay ahead. Those 3 years bought with 45,000 Ottoman lives may very well have saved Christian Europe from conquest. Mehmed came back in 1476 with 150,000 men, determined to erase the humiliation of Vaslui. At Valia Alba, the White Valley, the Ottomans won a tactical victory, but they paid so heavily that they withdrew anyway. Stephen's scorched earth strategy left nothing for an occupying army to live on. Mehmed learned that beating Moldavia in battle meant nothing if you couldn't hold the land. He died in 1481, never conquering Stephen's realm. Stephen ruled for 47 years, one of the greatest reigns in medieval Europe. He fought 50 battles and lost only 2, always outnumbered, always fighting for survival. Each victory bought time for a Christendom that rarely understood the price he paid. When he died in 1504, All of Europe mourned. The man who saved a civilization with 20,000 farmers and unmatched tactical brilliance was later canonized by the Orthodox Church as Saint Stephen the Great, defender of the faith through strategy and courage. His military legacy reads like a modern field manual. Use terrain, mix your forces, break the enemy's mind, deceive at every level. Stephen either invented or perfected all of it. Armies still study Vaslui as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. If you're outnumbered 6-1, don't fight fair. Use every edge. Make the land your ally. Turn weather into a weapon. Twist your enemy's strengths into vulnerabilities. Modern parallels are everywhere. Finnish ski troops bleeding the Soviets echo Moldavian archers in the fog. Vietnamese jungle fighters mirror Stephen's use of terrain. Afghan mountain warriors show the same truth. Empires struggle when defenders know every ridge and ravine better than they do. The lesson goes deeper than tactics. Vaslui proves that human ingenuity beats brute force when applied with discipline. Stephen didn't just defeat an army. He solved a deadly equation of numbers, terrain, and timing. Where others saw hopeless odds, he saw an engineering problem. While most rulers would have run or surrendered, he spent 3 years turning his homeland into a machine built for one purpose: survival. 20,000 men proved that with genius and preparation, even an empire at its height can bleed. The Ottomans, at the peak of their power, rulers from the Danube to the Nile, discovered that raw strength has limits when it meets defenders fighting on their own ground. Every future conqueror would remember the lesson. Overwhelming force is worthless if you can't bring it to bear. In that fog-choked valley, the fate of 2 civilizations hung on a knife's edge, and genius beat numbers. The meaning of the battle reaches far beyond Christian versus Muslim or Europe versus Asia. It stands as permanent proof that brilliance, preparation, and intimate knowledge of home ground can overcome any odds. Stephen the Great gave history a lesson written in Ottoman blood. When you're defending your home, every disadvantage can become a weapon if you're clever enough to use it. In the end, 120,000 Ottomans learned what 20,000 Moldavians already knew.